In this week's topic, we look at the policies developed by two of Fiji's influential governors, Sir Arthur Gordon and Sir John Bates-Thurston. And we refer to these suite of policies as the Gordon-Thurston settlement. Gradually, during the 15 years following cession, questions on land, capital, and labour were decided in a generally integrated fashion to form what we might call the Gordon-Thurston settlement. This week we examine the development and nature of the Gordon-Thurston settlement in relation to land, law, government administration, and taxation. In particular, we will focus on the following points. How was a system of indirect rule applied for the Italke? Remembering that the Italke refers to indigenous Fijians. What was the notion of time immemorial that underscored Gordon's land policy? What were the sources of Gordon's ideas, and what discrepancies became apparent in developing these ideas? What were the implications of taxation? And how long was the Gordon-Thurston settlement expected to last? Before we begin answering these questions, let's first look at the two men who played a pivotal role in developing British colonial policies towards indigenous Fijians at the end of the 19th century. First is Sir John Bates-Thurston, who first arrived in Fiji in 1865 and worked as a clerk with the British consul. Within a short time he took over as consul and soon became involved in disputes between indigenous Fijians and the growing number of European cotton planters. In 1872 he joined the government of Ratu Seru Thakambau as his chief secretary and played a central role in the negotiations that led to the Thakambau government making an offer of cession to Britain, on the condition that Fijian land ownership was protected. In 1874 he was involved in the attempts to form a constitutional government before Fiji's cession to Britain. Later in 1887 he was knighted, having acted as governor in the previous 2 years. Having performed this role successfully, he was formally appointed the governor of Fiji in 1888, as well as the High Commissioner for the Western Pacific, and he remained in both those positions until his death in 1897. Remember, at the time, the High Commission for the Western Pacific was based in Suva, Fiji, and the High Commissioner was responsible not only for the territories of Fiji, but also for the other British Pacific territories. He is notable as the longest-serving governor in the history of the colony of Fiji. The second individual is Sir Arthur Gordon, who was born into an aristocratic Scottish family and was the youngest son of a Prime Minister. Gordon had considerable administrative experience in the colonies before arriving in Fiji. He had served in New Brunswick, Trinidad and Mauritius, and he had seen the indentured labour system at work in those colonies. In 1875, he was appointed the new governor of the colony of Fiji just after the epidemic. He had taken over from the first governor, Sir Hercules Robinson, who was actually the Lieutenant Governor of New South Wales and who played a role in the signing of the Deed of Cession in 1874. When Gordon arrived, he was tasked with developing key policies to rule Britain's new colony in Fiji. Although he was a representative of the British government, he was known to have a sympathy for Indigenous peoples and was a strong champion of Indigenous rights. He believed in the responsibilities of hereditary chiefs, and is said to have assumed that because he was a Scottish laird, referring to a Scottish lord, he understood the Fijian chiefly system. He believed that white settlers in Fiji did not have the interest of Fijians at heart, and he was careful not to give them too much power. He believed it was the responsibility of governments to enforce conditions on plantations and to regulate Fijian life. In 1881, he would leave Fiji, but continued to defend the indigenous policies he had implemented there, as his role in the House of Lords by the name of Lord Stanmore. So how was a system of indirect rule applied to the Italki in the new British colony? One of the key features of British colonial rule in Fiji was a system of indirect rule. This is a system of governance used by the British and other European powers to control parts of their colonial empires, particularly in Africa and Asia, through pre-existing indigenous power structures. One example of indirect rule in Fiji was the creation of new administrative boundaries and titles. Some of these overlapped with traditional boundaries and titles. For the most part, these titles were held by men, and appointments were subject to the approval of the British governor, who was at the top of the pyramid. Some of the responsibilities of indigenous chiefs under the British colony of Fiji included collecting taxes and enforcing the policies of the colonial government. At the district and province levels, councils were held at regular intervals. If we look here, we see two tables comparing some of the divisions and leadership positions created by the new British administration. In terms of region, at the smallest level there was the koro, or the village. Several villages would form a tikina, or district, and these several districts would form a yasana, or a province. In Fiji today there are 14 provinces, but we will see in our discussion in the tutorials that the boundaries of tikinas and koros have changed over time. Responsible for governing these areas were 3 new positions created by the British administration. At the village level, there was a government representative called the Turangani Koro, or Chief of the Village is the literal translation. At the district level, Buli were appointed as chiefs of the districts. And at the province level, Roko or Roko Tui was the title to refer to provincial chiefs. These titles were adapted from indigenous words used by particular provinces within Fiji before the British arrived. For example, the term Roko or Roko Tui originally comes from Rewa, but was not used throughout Fiji. It was the British that standardized some of these terms and used them throughout the colony, when in actual fact there are a number of different forms of leadership systems at work in Fiji before colonial rule, and different administrative areas and chiefly titles at play. By creating these new systems which adapted traditional leadership systems, the British not only implemented their own forms of indirect rule, but they also changed the structure of Fijian society and overlooked some of the diversity within the peoples and islands of Fiji. And this may have created issues later in Fiji's history. The British also created an entirely new institution that had never existed in Fiji before. This was the Council of Chiefs, or in Fijian language, the Bose Vakaturanga. When it was initially created in 1876, it was simply called the Native Council. Later, in the 1900s, it was known as the Great Council of Chiefs. It continued until 2012, when it was disbanded by the Fiji government, and then re-established only recently in 2023. When the Council of Chiefs was first established in 1876, it was under the governorship of Sir Arthur Gordon. The decision was taken following consultations with chiefs, who advised Gordon on how best to govern the colony's indigenous population. In the words of anthropologist Robert Norton, it, quote, embodied the privileged relationship of trust and protection established between the Fijians and the British, end quote. During the colonial era, meetings of the Council of Chiefs were held every year or two, with rich ceremonial protocols, and they were always chaired by the British governor. Council members would advise the governor with regards to the policies on Indigenous affairs, and also relay his own wishes to the people. The records of these meetings are held in the National Archives of Fiji, and are a wonderfully rich primary source for further studies. In some rare instances, there are images like the one on the left, titled Great Council of Chiefs, Waikava, taken in 1876, and currently in the Cambridge Online Archives. Thakambau is pictured seated at the top of the ramp, above his brother Ratu Josefa Thelua. The chief to his left, wearing a white masi turban, is likely Musundroka Vunivalu of Rewa, according to the Cambridge archival source. As we will see in subsequent weeks, this new system of chiefs who ruled Fiji indirectly for the British would create its own challenges, particularly since these chiefs, although they may have held traditional titles, were appointed and sanctioned by the governor, and in doing so overlooked other chiefs who may have dissented or challenged British colonial rule.